All right, welcome everyone to our webinar today. My name is Bronson and I'm with Awardco. I'm the Director of Content here, and we have some great speakers that we're going to kind of introduce you to in a minute. We just want to welcome you, and if you want to pipe into the chat and tell us where you're calling from or where you're watching from, that would be really great. But just a little bit of a brief background on myself. I've been at Awardco for about 3.5 years. I'm really passionate about employee recognition and employee engagement, and you might see some ridiculous sideburns. That's because I'm involved in community theater production where I'm playing Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice, so that's why I have to have these giant, ridiculous looking things. But anyway, Chad, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, so Chad Hamilton, I have been at Awardco for about 1.5 years now, and my background is actually in HR. I got my master's degree in it. I worked as a senior consultant for a large banking technology company doing human capital analytics. And then since then, I've kind of come over to Awardco, and now I found my true passion in helping HR people find the right technologies for them. And I guess something interesting about me, all 3 of my kids are in pain right now after getting their tonsils removed. So it's it's been a doozy, the Hamilton household for now, but we're surviving.
Yeah, you'll get through it, right?
Yeah.
How long's the recovery for tonsil removal?
I was told 2+ weeks, something like that, and yesterday was one of the toughest ones, so hopefully they'll be okay.
Oh, yeah, we wish you all the best.
Thanks, appreciate it.
And Jessica, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, definitely. My name is Jessica Ricker. I am a senior HR manager at Vivint. I've been with Vivint for about 5.5 years. I started as an HR generalist and just have moved my way up throughout the organization, supporting various different leaders through Vivint, the organization. Now I'm currently within our revenue organization. I'm originally from Colorado, and a very small town called Estes Park. It's a tourist destination because the Rocky Mountain National Park is in my background. So it was really cool to grow up there. But before moving to Utah, there's the Coloradoans would call a 14er. So it's a mountain that's at 14,000 feet or higher. And Long's Peak is one of those mountains, and it was in my backyard. So I made a goal to hike it and summit that mountain before moving to Utah, and I was able to do that. So I'm a big hiker. I really love the outdoors and doing that. And another thing about me, we don't have kids, but we have 2 fur children. One is named Charlie, and the other one is a puppy, and we named him Rudy Go Bark after Rudy Gobert, and that was before he got traded. So that was a bummer. We debated changing his name, but Rudy Gobert is still a solid player, so we decided to keep it.
No matter where he plays, he's still great, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And the both of you went to school together, is that right? In your graduate program?
Yeah.
Is that at Utah State?
Yep.
Awesome.
Yeah.
What made you want to get into a graduate program for HR? Chad?
Yeah, so for me it was mainly because I did psychology as an undergrad.
Me too.
Yeah. Right. I think all 3 of us.
As me as well.
You were industrial organization?
Yep.
Yeah. That's amazing. Awesome.
Yeah, so it's kind of like loving how the human brain works. And I thought that would be a great path kind of going into an HR function where I then get to apply what I've learned in school into a business setting, and I thought that was a good transition. And I really enjoyed it, and it was a lot of fun. So yeah.
Cool. About yourself?
Yeah, so started out with psychology. I did my undergrad at Colorado State and explored various different areas, but I loved the idea of human behavior in the workplace, right? We spend so much of our time at work, and a lot of time we spend more time with our coworkers and our boss and at our organization than we do with our friends and our family. And there's this concept that was around how impactful leaders are on their employees, not just for their career, but also their personal growth, and how we can take some of this home. And so our leaders play such a key role in not only your satisfaction of an employee, but satisfaction as a human as well. So Utah State came to recruit when I was at Colorado State, and I was like, this is a really great transition into applying where I feel the most passion.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both for sharing your backgrounds. This
Of course.
is going to be a great webinar because we're going to be talking about a little bit of the psychology behind recognition and gratitude and all that kind of thing. So we're excited to dive in. As you can see here on the title slide, we're talking about the future of the workplace, the future of recognition. And we're talking about how you can use recognition and engagement to win over the hearts and minds of your employees. So we're going to talk about employee appreciation, a little bit about brain science, and the ROI of gratitude. Thanksgiving is next week, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's going to be a big deal for a lot of us, and so gratitude is on all of our minds and we'll talk a little bit about that. Before we do that, we want to kind of set the stage a bit. We want to talk about what the current state of the workplace is. And there's a lot of anxiety out there. And Jessica, have you experienced this? I mean, you were just telling me before the webinar started that you support sometimes thousands of employees.
Yep.
How have you seen the common or just the experience of the workplace change over the last year or two? I mean, the pandemic was a big deal, but even since then, what has been your experience leading people in HR?
Yeah, it's been really interesting because it's not just the pandemic, right, and how our lives have shifted in that space, but also how that has shifted the way that we work, right? We've got employees that are now really seeing that they enjoy work from home, or that their lives have shifted, so they have to make sure that they're stay-at-home moms or dads, but they're also working at the same time.
Yeah.
So there's anxiety around making sure that they're performing well, but taking care of their kids. I think just the way we navigate the world now is very different, and so we've seen that show up in just various different places.
Yeah, absolutely. And as humans, a lot of us don't adapt very well or very quickly. And so there's been a lot of change over the last few years.
Yep.
And it's been really difficult for many of us to adapt to that. Many of you are HR leaders that are watching this. I'm sure you've experienced that as well, leading the people that you lead. And as we look here about some of what you might be experiencing, some employee discontent maybe, some interpersonal relationships, these are common things that are always part of the workplace. The Great Resignation, a lot of us might say that that's kind of over now. In fact, I heard or read an article the other day that said, is it the Great Resignation and now it's the Great Remorse? Because people resigned from their job and now it might be more difficult for them to find another job.
Yeah.
Very, very challenging. Chad, as you've been talking to people in your role here at Wardco, what have you seen as for the people that are looking for solutions to these issues?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. One of the things that we've seen is that since there was a huge shift in employees, and a lot of people 6 months ago, they were trying to figure out ways in retaining those employees.
Yeah.
And preventing them from jumping ship and going to other locations or other companies. But now we're seeing a different reasoning for retaining those individuals, and it's more of like how do we make sure that these newly onboarded individuals feel accepted within the company? And that's where we're seeing a big shift is, yes, all of these employees have shifted to new companies. Now, how do we make them feel accepted? How do we make them happy for the decision that they made and not have this buyer's remorse type of thing?
Yeah.
And so we're seeing a lot of new HR people or the leadership within HR saying, okay, how do we retain these individuals that are brand new to the company while also retaining those people that might be looking elsewhere?
Yeah. Have you dealt with that at Vivint, Jessica?
Yeah, a little bit. I think part of it, while you were talking, Chad, something that popped into my mind around the area of gratitude, right, recognition and reward, is specifically when we have a hybrid flexible or hybrid friendly environment. And we've struggled with that in a space of having teams that are a mixed bag, right? Where we've had people who have decided to move and relocate with the pandemic, but they've stayed employed with Vivint while, if we've got, let's say we have a group of 5, one person is remote while the other 4 are in office. What is the dynamic there, and making sure that there's still there's inclusion there, they're feeling recognized, and community and connection. We've been doing a lot of conversation around having intentional one-on-ones with the leader to the employee, and then also just having the leader make sure to be intentional that how can we get that person, can we get them in office maybe once a quarter and make sure that they're still having that connection, and it not being where you have your team meetings and your one-on-ones strictly focused on temperature checks of the projects you're working on or the challenges you're facing, but mostly about having something that is, like I said, intentional around connection with the employees and checking in with who they are as humans and not just what they're doing at work.
I have a question about that because a lot of times, as I've been talking to HR admins, it can be really hard to get a manager or to train a manager how to connect with someone. Well, some of us might feel like it's intuitive, right? You just talk to somebody. But a lot of people don't necessarily feel that same way. So how would the both of you address that too? I mean, we'll talk more about this. We don't want to linger too much on the discontent going on right now. But how do you get a manager to connect with someone? Is it a matter of training? Is it a matter of you are showing by example. What do you think, Jessica? We'll start with you.
Yeah, you'll probably hear this a lot from me. I think it's my background in psychology as well as HR, but it depends, right?
Sure.
So if you have your leader and they're connecting on a one-on-one basis with their employee, the first thing that I do as a HR partner is I ask about, are they having at least one intentional one-on-one per month, so that they can schedule that to make sure that they're doing more than just a check-in or a temperature check on the work. But as far as engaging in that conversation, I like to give them, if they're not so much of a, let's say, an extrovert, right? They don't have that kind of outgoing personality, and it's hard for them to think of the questions that they want to ask to get that connection with that person. Role playing with them is really helpful, giving them a list of questions. And sometimes, it could be even that you connect with your employee, they bring up something that you're similar. Let's say, I know that you're an NBA fan, right, Chad?
Yeah.
And be like, oh yeah, the Jazz had a great game last night. And you can start having those conversations. So knowing what they're interested in, or even just asking about their career or what their aspirations are. What was a peak and a valley in the week that you had when you're connecting, and like what are those things that are kind of going on? And then if the conversation kind of lulls, then coming back and saying, can you expand on that a little bit? Like, that was really interesting what you just said, or like what was your experience there? So just trying to dig in a little bit deeper as you feel comfortable. You want to make sure that it's authentic and genuine, and that's critical as well. So making sure that the leader knows they can go as deep as they feel comfortable and as the relationship stands then, and then that relationship will build as well. I think that's at one level. At another level, it would be on the team side, is just being very conscious of what kind of connections and experiences are you creating for your team, right? If you're in a remote environment, or you've got some people who are remote and some that are here, I've seen us be really creative with things like Kahoots. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Kahoots. It's like the games are like questions and stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
And so I've seen it where, you reach out to the team, you have them all answer maybe 4 or 5 similar questions, and then they all get to know their team members because they're answering, maybe it's, Bronson, if I'm guessing Bronson likes theater, let's say, or Chad. Chad likes basketball. And so you kind of get to know the interests, and you get more familiar with your team.
Yeah.
So you feel a deeper sense of connection.
Yeah, I like how you said that it has to be genuine, because a lot of times people, when they're encouraged to meet with someone else and get to know them, it can feel really disingenuous.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But it's important to do that. Thank you for sharing that. John, what would you add to that?
Yeah, one thing that was a huge, I would say, differentiator for a lot of managers, that when I was in my HR experience, I would see some managers be more successful, and that is level setting expectations for both parties, meaning for the manager and for the employee. And a lot of employees, and it goes back to what you were saying, where it's creating this not disingenuous, the opposite. It's
authentic?
a genuine, authentic, there we go.
There we go.
It's creating an authentic relationship between them. And it's also managing those expectations where it's like, yes, we can have a good relationship, but we also need to make sure that we're doing the work that we need to. So one of those aspects that was really great was having a manager say, how do you want to be managed? And it was that question had never been posed to me before. And I was like,
What'd you say?
I was like, well, just let me do my work and I'll get it done. And then if I'm slacking, then we'll have a conversation. And it was really good because it held myself accountable. And in some cases, other people love to be managed and say, hey, make sure that I'm hitting these types of goals throughout the day.
Yeah.
So for me and what I've seen as successful managers, they're able to have that communication between their employees and making sure that they're not being overly managed. And then there's the relationship between in-person management and then also virtual management. I think that's a huge balance that becomes really difficult for all employees. And for me, it was being able to check in with the management teams and saying, okay, where are we at? How are we doing?
Yeah.
And then also those relationships business-wise develop, as well as kind of a friendly relationship as well.
I like that. So setting expectations and then eventually letting it grow into something that's maybe starts as business but then grows into something more, and that ties in with what you were saying, Jessica.
Yeah.
Something that I think ties both of what you've said together is gratitude.
Yep.
Right? And gratitude, there are many, many studies about gratitude, how it influences your ability to think better and all sorts of things, and your attitudes. And a lot of times gratitude might be derisively thought of. We're like, just be grateful and everything will be fine. It's not quite the case, and that's not what we're going to talk about. But gratitude does have a measurable impact. And when we're talking about gratitude, we hope that because Thanksgiving is next week, then maybe it's already on your mind. But gratitude in this sense is synonymous, and we'll kind of use them synonymously throughout this webinar with recognition, appreciation, recognition, gratitude, whatever you want to call it, right? Because it all impacts the brain in the same space. So we did a study with HR, I think it was HR.com, where 40% of modern workers say they're not recognized enough. Now, it depends on which study you look at. The one that we did said this, and then there are many others that say it's more, that say it's less. I think the main point is that many people feel like they're not recognized enough. And I think remote work plays into that, because if you're not around someone, it's just human nature not to think about them. It's unfortunate, right? Because you're like, I really care about you, but I'm just, this might be a ridiculous example, but I'm not around my parents a lot. And so I sometimes am like, oh gosh, I gotta get in touch with them. I gotta call them. Yeah. So how do we do that in a remote setting? How can you express gratitude? How can you wrap someone in? You're talking about this just briefly, both of you. But what is one way that you can continue to recognize people even that aren't in the office or that you don't see often? Because it may not be like a hybrid thing where it's remote or in office. It might be that they're on the manufacturing floor and you don't see them that often. Or it might be that they're in like your summer sales, you were talking about summer sales.
Yeah.
You don't meet those people, and it's not like it's your responsibility to recognize them, but how do you help managers do that?
Yeah, I think it's, for that group specifically, it's really great to have organizations or teams that help with competitions and incentives and knowing what the recognition language is of your people or of that department, right? So from a summer sales standpoint, they're really driven by competition, right? So throughout the year they have various different competitions and incentives. They also do daily goals with their team manager, and those are always celebrated as well. One thing that actually Chad and I have been working on together is for the insurance team that I support as well, that we're building out a recognition program. Well, one group of employees in that department, they are all remote. And so we're really focusing on how can we do peer-to-peer recognition even in a virtual environment like Slack. How can we create experiences that drive that connection, that people feel authentic and genuine recognition or gratitude, even if it's just a simple shout out and having someone get shout out, and then having that building engagement and kind of momentum so other people are jumping on that and calling out that person as well. Not so much in the virtual environment, but one thing that on one of the first teams I started on at Vivint, every week when we had our staff meeting, we started with shout outs. And so it didn't have to be on our team, but we wanted to recognize and give gratitude to someone who has helped us. Or someone that we've seen went above and beyond or helped us out on a program or just did something really, really incredible. And what I loved about that was it was a moment, especially if you're recognizing the help that they provided, that is giving them gratitude, right? Yeah. But if we're doing it with, if let's say, Bronson, you and I are on a team and I shout out Chad.
Yeah.
Chad's not on our team, but that makes you think, you know what? I think I'm going to go talk to Chad and say, hey, Jess recognized you in our shout outs this morning. Sounds like you did really awesome work there.
Yeah.
And so it's a very organic way to have people understand what contributions are being made and how it's impacting those on your team.
Yeah, absolutely. Recognition can be integrated into any part of your workflow. Like you're saying at the beginning of a meeting. Mm-hmm. We do that, right, Chad? Yeah. We do that a lot. Does your team do that specifically?
Yeah, and to build off of what she was saying as well, like our team is very connected. I think the team that I'm currently on is probably one of the strongest teams I've ever been a part of in terms of recognition, and like we actually hang out outside of work, which is really cool. Yeah. Something that I've never been a part of before, so that's really cool. But building off of what Jess was saying is not only are you able to see the recognitions, like whenever somebody comes in through Slack, where you can see that I was recognized by Jess, but it's cross-functional. So it's not just within the team, but it's organization-wide, which I think is huge because it's a giant culture builder. Yeah. And it goes unnoticed, or I would say it's underrated how impactful these cross-functional recognitions go, where you're just saying, okay, hey, Bronson, this was really cool. We're not in the same function, However, this builds the culture of recognition across the entire company, which, again, is probably one of the most underrated things because it shows how interactive your employees are. And then also it engages those remote workers. Again, like Jess was saying, it puts it back onto the top of your mind of, oh yeah, that person does work here, you know? And and like one of my best friends, he works here, but he's remote. And then every time I see a recognition come in for him, and I'm like, oh yeah, Penner's here, and then I'll recognize him. People then start kind of piling on, and it's whether it's a keeping up with the Joneses or a genuine reaction, it's really cool to see how interactive this can become, just showing the gratitude for one another.
Yeah. It's almost like gratitude is contagious.
Yes, that's exactly
right.
it.
Yeah.
And speaking of pandemics and all that, maybe there's a pandemic of positivity you can start out, right?
That's
like
a great one.
Being grateful. Gratitude has a power that I think a lot of us overlook, and that's at the core of recognition, is recognizing people and being grateful for them. So this is in addition to that stat we just talked about 40% feel like they're not recognized enough. 93% of employees that feel valued or thanked by their employers report feeling more motivated to do their best work. Have you experienced that, Chad? When you've been personally recognized?
Yeah, and it's not just like simple recognitions, and I'll share a story and I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. But when I first started at Awardco, I had a baby. Well, my wife had the baby. I didn't do very much. But my wife had our baby, and this was number 3, so it's not like we hadn't gone through this, but it was a very unique situation. Where in this birth, there was a ton of complications which landed him in the NICU. Very emotional time for us, right? It's never something that I would ever wish on anybody. And so due to these complications, we weren't able to leave the hospital with our baby, which was the first time that's ever happened to us. And it was extremely emotional. We're driving back, empty car seat.
Man.
I promise it gets better.
I don't even have kids, and that's
heartbreaking.
I'll fast forward to he's fine now. He's great, hitting all of his milestones. But we're driving back from the hospital, and it's this really emotional time. And we get to our front door, and we're parked, and our kids are excited to meet their little brother, but he's not there. But there was a box sitting on our doorstep that, and I had no idea what it was, but it ended up being a bonus box from Awardco saying, hey, congratulations on your baby. We opened it up. There's a card from Steve Sonnenberg, our CEO, saying, hey, I heard what happened. I'm really sorry. Know that we're pulling for you.
Wow.
And it was the most amazing experience I have ever had, because at that point I was like, well, Awardco's going to have to figure out some way to get me out. I'm never going anywhere at this point.
Yeah.
But it was so impactful, and these are the experiences you can create for your employees by doing simple acts of gratitude, or just recognizing them, whether that's for a job well done or these pivotal moments in people's lives. But getting that card with all of the trinkets in there were obviously geared towards my wife, and she's the one doing all the hard work. But it was so impactful for me and my family at that moment that we're like, well, Awardco figured out a way to get an employee for life, and these are the little things where it goes 93% of people are motivated. This goes to speak to that. So that's my little 2 cents.
That's a really cool story.
Can I jump on that?
Please.
Yeah.
So what I love about that story, and thanks for being vulnerable and sharing that, I think we all can kind of connect when we've had traumatic events that happen in our life, and the way our company shows up for us and supports us through those is so impactful. But I also think it's something that it took probably, maybe let's say an hour, right? It took Steve, is it?
Yeah.
It took Steve 30 seconds to write that card. And when we think about gratitude and recognition, it doesn't always have to be this large, grand gesture. And it's just the initial thought to even just say, hey, thank you so much for your help, or hey, we really appreciate you, and you're adding a ton of value to our organization. Communicating that to the employee within that moment, it means more sometimes than getting even if you got a card and you didn't get all the trinkets, that card would still hold some impact for you,
100%,
right?
Yep.
It's just really interesting when those things happen, and that we think it has to be this big, grand program, and those are very, very, not saying that they're not great, they are, and they're very, very useful. But But sometimes we err on that side of thinking that's how we need to be impactful for gratitude and recognition, and that's not always the case. Sometimes it's just very small gestures that can really make you feel valued and appreciated, which comes back to like this statistic is that if they're feeling more engaged, more times it's because they feel valued and appreciated, and the way that we get there is by showing gratitude and recognizing the individuals.
Absolutely. And conversely, if you don't find the time to recognize somebody, even if it's simple, right? Great job today. Thanks for being part of everything. That can impact the value that employee feels hugely.
Yeah.
And you might not know what's happening. Like they might start to feel disenchanted, and they might start to feel less and less engaged, like quiet quitting, right? That's what we're talking about.
Definitely.
I think recognition, as trite as it may sound, is the solution to that.
Yeah. Even the low-hanging fruit, like anniversaries. Everybody has an anniversary,
totally.
and it's the easiest thing to recognize where it's like, congrats, here you go. This is awesome. You completed another year. And a lot of times people just want to feel validated in that. And there's no extra anything to it. They just sort of like, they just want to get recognition or validation from leadership saying, hey, congrats on 3 years, thanks for being here.
Yeah.
That's all you need to do.
Yeah.
And it's really easy and simple to do.
It absolutely is. And what we want to talk about now is what is your brain actually doing when you feel that, right? Because gratitude and recognition and appreciation, they have an influence on the receiver, obviously, like we've been talking about, but also the giver. And I'm really excited because the both of you have backgrounds in psychology. I'd love to hear your thoughts and your opinions. This is going to be really great. So we want to talk about your brain on recognition. Do you remember those old, maybe I'm showing my age here, but they were like your brain on drugs? Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
It was like a cracked egg or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Remember that, right? Your brain on recognition is not a cracked egg. It's a lot more wholesome. Anyway.
It's a full egg.
Yeah, it's a full egg. Yeah, full and nice and whole. Yeah. So your brain, there are 3 areas that we're going to talk about briefly. We don't want to hit on it too hard because this is pretty involved, like biomedical stuff and things like that. But there are 3 parts of your brain that light up when you receive or when you give recognition or gratitude. So think about this if you're going somewhere for Thanksgiving and you feel someone express gratitude for you, or you express it, better yet, to someone else. Think about like, oh yeah, there's these 3 areas of my brain that are lighting up if you were on an MRI. So the anterior cingulate cortex, you don't have to remember that. We're not going to quiz anybody. It's responsible for feelings of empathy, impulse control, emotion, and decision making. So basically, when you feel gratitude, this part of your brain lights up and you feel more connected to people, right? Like you feel, when you got that letter from Steve, like, I am connected to a workout.
Oh, yeah.
Feelings of empathy, both from Steve and from you, right? And you have better impulse control. It can make you have a more even keel, right? You're not reacting to things heavily. You're like, well, maybe let's take a breather, let's take a step back, stuff like that. Emotions, decision making, all of these functions are improved by expressing gratitude or receiving it. And then the medial prefrontal cortex helps you in better decision making. It kind of evens out those chemicals so that you can make better logistical decisions and better logical decisions, and so you can think more clearly about problems, whether that's interpersonal relationships or whether that's a problem at work, things like that. And then the hypothalamus helps you calm down, essentially. And so running through that, I know you both have a background in psychology. How does recognition, when thinking about psychology, how does recognition improve a person's personal experience, either in work or outside of it? We've touched a little bit on this, but I'm wondering if either of you have any additional thoughts you'd like to add to that.
I think you bring up a good point, which is everything just becomes a lot easier, or you have an even keel, where there might be disappointing things that happen in work, and that's just what happens, right?
Yeah.
Everybody's going to have good days, everybody's going to have bad days. But to be completely honest, like within Awardco, I've been able to have like the most mellow time ever because...
And you have a stressful job, too.
Boy, do
like,
I. Yeah.
That's saying something.
It's like, end of quarter's coming up. Let's go.
Yeah.
And so it becomes a lot easier for me to accomplish my tasks because these recognitions come in, and it's kind of just able to subdue any feelings of anxiety or anything like that. It's like, hey, keep up the good work. And that's all that it is, right? It's nothing fancy. It's nothing insane where it's like this huge page love letter to me or anything like that, which, I mean, if you want to write me one, that's fine.
I'll write you one after this.
But it makes me just kind of grounded in a better...
That's a good way to describe it.
Yeah. And so it keeps me grounded, and and level-headed as, the ups and downs and ebbs and flows of work happen through the day-to-day process. And in sales, it becomes really difficult, but it just becomes kind of like the calming waters, if anything.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Jessica, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, so it's really interesting in what I was starting to think about as we were going over the different parts of the brain. Specifically with the ACC, we're talking about empathy, right? And I'm a big Brene Brown fan.
Yeah.
And what she talks about with empathy is that a lot of times we think that for us to have empathy for someone is that we have a shared experience that is exactly the same and we've experienced the exact same emotions. But that's not always the case. Really what she talks about is how we all can have a different traumatic experience or like a bad day. What are the underlying emotions that we're experiencing from that occurrence? And do we relate to those? And I think we really do. And so that's what empathy really is knowing that some of the feelings that Chad may have been going through with what he shared with us before, right? Feeling scared. How do I communicate this to my kiddos so they understand that their brother is okay, and he's going to come home? So feeling scared, feeling sad, all of these things, we've experienced those ourselves as well, right? So it's not about is the experience exactly the same. Now, how does this relate to giving gratitude and recognition? Sometimes it's more just recognizing what someone is experiencing in that moment and saying, hey, you're going through something really hard right now. How can I help you? Or, hey, you're carrying this really, really well. And I just praise the good work that you're doing and what you're carrying right now. You feel connected. You don't feel alone. And I think that's what, when it comes to your hard days at work, or you make a mistake, right? You feel like I've made plenty of mistakes or lessons learned, as I'd like to call them, at Vivint, being there for as long as I have. And when I recognize that we all make those mistakes and we're not alone in that, you feel more apt to collaborate, to find out what is the solution. You feel more engaged. You don't feel like, oh shoot, I'm gonna have to tell my boss this and then I'm gonna get fired. And you start going down this spiral of chaos and anxiety, right? But if you know that your organization has a culture of gratitude and of recognition, you feel safe to show up as your authentic self every single day. You're okay with calling out your mistakes and your lessons learned because you know there's empathy across the group and that they'll support you through that. I think it comes from starting with the empathy piece, but then also creating this safe space and also sharing gratitude and recognition and just holding space for each other in your wins and in your losses.
Yeah. I'm reminded as you were sharing all of that, thank you for that, by the way, that it seems to me that it comes down to individuals.
Yeah.
Right? It's an individual interaction. It's not necessarily a company-wide initiative, although that can facilitate individual interactions. Yeah. How do you get leaders in the company to buy into something like this? Because, for example, lots of companies, and rightfully so, a business is there to make money. Mm-hmm. That's what it's there for. But how do you get a leader who may be focused on that part of things to also focus, when it might be a little more difficult for them to focus on individuals?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I'll let you answer that one.
For me, is I kind of put it back on them and say, tell me about a time that you had a leader that was transformational for your career, or a mentor in someone. What were those characteristics? They invested time in me. They were present when they invested that time with me. And I say, okay, that's great. So that experience you had with that leader, don't you want to create that for your team too?
Yeah.
Because you're not just recruiting them to stay on your team. Let's talk about retention, right? But also you should be the leader that they vote to stay with. So you're also recruiting them to stay on your team as well, as much as you want them to be on your team.
Yeah.
And so that's where I kind of walk them through, is kind of putting it back on them for them to understand that they are, yes, your employees own their engagement. They own their career. They're in that driver's seat for their career, but we are creating the road that they drive on. And so how do we create that to be a smooth, enjoyable road trip with all of the best snacks and the best jams? And those are the different interactions that the leaders can provide with.
Yeah. I love that. Chad, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think she brings up a good point where it's coming up with those genuine interactions, kind of like what we had talked about before, where it's like, okay, what can I do to provide for my employees? And there has to be a mental shift in there.
Yeah.
One of the best leaders that I've ever had, and the reason why he was so good at what he did, not only did he have every part of business acumen that you needed, but he was also able to create all of these really genuine relationships. He was one of the best gift givers I've ever met.
Yeah.
And we had talked about this before, where interactions with management and their employees is kind of like love languages,
Yeah.
right? Whether it's words of affirmation or whatever it is. In this case, he was a gift giver, and he would take all of the information that he would get from me or one of my peers, and then apply those gifts to everything that he would kind of acquire. So in this case, it was like I was very family oriented, so he planned a getaway for me and my wife to have it was a sales incentive, so we had budget.
Yeah,
but it was so cool to see. For me, that's what he gave me, but for another one of my peers, it was like a season pass to a snowboarding one of the local snow ranges, whatever they're called.
Ski resorts?
Ski resorts things.
Snow ranges.
Yeah, one of those things. And like new goggles and all this other stuff. And so everybody had these individualized gifts, and it was these genuine actions that he was doing.
Yeah. What about when, we talked a little bit about this briefly. So these are all really great tips to get people to, especially managers, to engage. What about when if a manager comes to you and says, yeah, I can do that, but it's not going to be genuine? Can you force, I don't believe you, personally, I don't believe you can force anyone to do it. But how can you teach or encourage or what tools would you give to a manager that feels like, yeah, but if I sit down and give a recognition, it's just not going to feel like me. Or if I do this for my employee, it's not going to feel like me because I don't do that very frequently now, so like it's going to feel weird if I try and start doing it now. What would you say to someone like that?
Yeah, so one is I kind of put on my HR hat in this, and if you were the manager, I'd be like, help me understand why. Why don't you want to engage in this space? Do you not believe in it? If you don't believe in it, let me provide some data and some understanding on how this really impacts the commitment, the motivation, the engagement, the satisfaction to your employees and how that feels. And then also, like, is it that they don't believe in it? Is it that they don't have the time, the capacity to do something they feel like it's administrative and they need it to be automated? Are they in a really busy time of their year and it feels very daunting for them? Okay, if that's the case, then what can we do that is small and easy and convenient for you? What do we already have that we could work into this, right? Do you do a monthly all hands, and could you do a shout out or something of the sort? How can we make it feel a bit more digestible and more attainable for that manager? So I think it's first really understanding why they don't want to engage in that space. Also, are they not feeling recognized and appreciated? So they have a feeling of, well, why would I do that if I'm not getting recognized? And that to me would be a big kind of check engine light as an HR professional of this is a greater issue on this team and the next level above. Like, we should talk about that, about what is the recognition program and why aren't we having these conversations? Because it again doesn't have to be as big and grand as we always think it needs to be.
And it starts from the top down, right?
Yeah.
If your recognition programs or your culture of recognition, like you were talking about, Chad, if it doesn't start from the top, then how can you expect everyone else to buy into that?
Definitely.
Right? It's like a value that you are supposed to be touting.
Yeah.
Something like that, yeah. So thank you both for that. That's really great. I landed on this slide just so you here attending the webinar can kind of see some of a lot of this is tongue-in-cheek, right? If an appreciated employee is great with kids, they're a little more emotionally stable, they have smoother skin. A lot of that may not be true, but it's funny, so we put it in there. But the science behind it is that when you feel recognized, when you feel gratitude, or when you express gratitude or give recognition, you have calmer emotions, you have better and more empathy, you're better decision making, increased stability, like you were saying, calmer waters.
Yes.
I like that a lot. And greater happiness. That's just the way the science works. That's the way your neurotransmitters work in your brain. That it activates just a better you, so to speak. So now we want to briefly touch on the generations of gratitude because we want to continue to give you solutions. We're going to go through this part a little bit more quickly and then we're going to talk about what can you do now? What are some steps you can actually take? So generations of gratitude, by this we mean workforce makeup, different generations. How do they express and how do they receive gratitude? Like love languages, like we were just talking about. That's really awesome. So we're going to go through these briefly. Boomers, adults born obviously between this, and these stats are from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, so you can find these online as well. They make up about 21% of the population currently, and currently they're 25% of the workforce. So I wonder if, in either of your experience, do you feel like boomers, and I don't want to keep using that because I feel like it's somewhat has a little bit of a negative connotation, older individuals, shall we say, do they experience and receive recognition differently? Does it mean something, or does one form of recognition mean more to them than another? What do you think, Jeff?
I think a lot of what they've experienced throughout their entire work history is very different than what we are today.
Yeah, totally.
So whether or not they're used to recognition, it's probably really nice for them now.
Yeah.
When they first started and entered the workforce, maybe it wasn't as big of a priority for a lot of these companies, and it was kind of like, okay, focused on bottom line, and let's just get to what we need to.
Yeah.
But nowadays, I always bring back the question, like, why wouldn't you recognize? Because, like, does somebody not want to be recognized for what they do? Mm-hmm. And kind of like what Jess was saying before with the check engine light. Is it a top-down process? Is there something that's missing in the middle? Mm-hmm. And I think for these individuals that are closer to retirement, if we can continue to recognize them, maybe that will encourage them to continue working. But I think that's something that we need to keep in mind is why aren't we recognizing them, and why don't they want to be recognized if that's the case?
Yeah. I like that you brought up that they may have experienced recognition differently earlier on in their career. This is an extreme example, but my dad is from West Virginia, and he went and worked in coal mines when he started when he was 14. And he worked in coal mines until he was, until he went into the military. But I think about that, and I just can't imagine recognition happening much in a coal mine.
Yeah, no, not really.
Like, hey, thanks for, loading all that coal, or thanks for hitting that high coal and stuff like that. I just don't think that was part of, that's an extreme example, obviously. But being a millennial, I look at that, I'm like, wow. My dad is like from a totally different generation, And it's important to realize that there are different expectations, different languages of recognition, so to speak. And then we go into Gen X. They make up 19% of the workforce, of the population, and 33% of the workforce. Jess, do you work often with anyone in Gen X? Or even if you don't, how would you say that they might experience recognition differently?
Yeah, what I've noticed too on the slide before with boomers, right, is that it says thank them regularly. Then if you go to the Gen X one, it says appreciate them often, right? A lot of times we have this thought that saying thank you is also showing appreciation, and I think it truly is. That's not me saying that it's not, but it's really knowing what is the recognition language, and I love that you bring that up because that's the way. It's not just recognition language, feedback language, communication language that each of us do, because if we're not communicating or recognizing in the same language, it's not going to land, right? You're like, oh, that's really nice, but if I would rather be recognized in a shout out by my boss and I get a Vivint swag like a beanie or something of the sort, I'm like, oh, that's nice, but it doesn't satiate my feeling of being appreciated. So I think it's just really understanding what the languages are throughout each of the generations, but not just that, each person on your team, right? You could have a boomer that would likes to hear thank you a lot and know that their work is being valued. You could have another one that wants a gift card. You could have another one that wants a handwritten note from you or wants to go to lunch with you as their boss. So it's not just the generational differences, but I think it's getting back to that individual level.
I love that you brought that up because that is actually, I'm going to kind of breeze through these really quick. So you see boomers, Gen X, appreciate them often, like you said. Millennials, appreciate them and they'll appreciate you. Gen Z, all of these, I think the main core of it you just hit on, Jess, is that you just appreciate them, And it's not, we're painting with a broad brush here. We're saying that, perhaps we might be sounding like we're inferring that boomers want to be appreciated this way and Gen Z this way. It's not necessarily the case like you're talking about. It's just individuals, right? Yeah. Like my dad probably would enjoy just as much of a thank you as I would at this point, right?
Working in the coal mines, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I think a really good point was the millennial side of things, and we see this often is that a lot of times millennials just want to feel validated in what they're doing or appreciated, and they'll in turn appreciate you. It's very much reciprocal in that regard, and we see that all the time where if they aren't appreciated, the way that they kind of rebel against the lack of appreciation is going to look for somewhere where they are appreciated. And so this is a huge win for a lot of companies if they can just appreciate or recognize those millennials. I fall into that bucket. I was brought up on receiving a trophy for participation. It is what it is.
Yeah.
That's
the same way.
But in terms of me, I've felt that before where I wasn't appreciated at one company, and so my desire to look elsewhere was increased. And so I think that's hitting the nail on the head right there.
Yeah, and Jess, you touched on this earlier as well, that and it reminded me of that phrase that people don't leave bad jobs, they leave bad managers.
Yep.
Right? And if anyone, regardless of whether they're a millennial or a Gen Z, if they feel appreciated and if they feel valued, they're way less likely to go looking elsewhere. Your retention is way better.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think it's because we all, and I'm not sure if it's generational, but I think that as employees, we place a lot of self-worth into our job, right?
Yeah.
What we produce, how we produce it, is it quality, is it efficient, is it effective? And so when we feel like what we're doing doesn't matter, that's a really crappy feeling to have. It's heavy, it's dark. And so the appreciation is saying, I'm adding value. I'm adding significant contributions to not only the groups that in my world, mine goes, okay, what kind of HR value am I adding for the leaders I support? What value and contributions am I adding to my team members and our HR organization that we are within? If I don't feel like I'm adding that value, what am I doing there?
Yeah.
And if it's not that it's being, and I think part of it even hurts worse as an employee when you feel that you're adding the value and either there's a perception gap where it's not being communicated or your leadership doesn't feel like you're being, or that you're adding the value that you think you are, and that gap really needs to close. But it's really just about feeling valued and that you are adding the value as well. So again, going back to what Chad said, that it's reciprocated, right? It's a two-way street and making sure that you feel that so you're not carrying that heavy kind of darkness of what am I doing here? What am I contributing to? Because it's not just like the legacy of you as an employee, but also the legacy of how you are spending your time.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you brought that up. That darkness is kind of real, when you don't feel valued, whether in work or outside of it.
Yeah.
Right? If you don't feel seen as a human, that is really difficult to deal with. Very difficult. And so now what we want to do is we've already talked about the workplace woes of today. We want to talk about the workplace of tomorrow. What can admins, everyone here on this webinar, what can they do? What can you do to help achieve some of this, to implement some of this in your current workforce? We've talked a lot about the benefits of recognition. We've talked a lot about what it can do for people and organizations. Great. How do we do it? At Awardco, we talk about, there's another psychology thing, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's a triangle, and where you get your most basic needs met, and then you can move on to the next one and the next one. We've kind of appropriated that and changed it into something that we like to call reimagined recognition. So we start with the very basis of celebrate. Everyone deserves to be celebrated, like you're talking about, Chad, right?
Yep. They're the easiest things to do, and a lot of times we can automate that. So Awardco's technology can automate that. That's not the point of this, but it's mainly just onboarding service anniversaries and birthdays. Everybody has a birthday.
Yeah.
Everybody has a service anniversary. And then when you're onboarded into these new companies, especially, and this is probably a bigger topic now because everybody from the Great Resignation has gone through the onboarding process.
Yeah.
Or maybe they're still going through it. But these are some of the baseline things that we can accomplish as HR professionals, is that these are so easy to accomplish and they're low-hanging fruit. It's just, are we doing that, and is it done in an effective manner?
Yeah, It's very easy to accomplish, and those are 3 really great examples. And there's even more, like holidays.
Yep.
Like there's always a holiday someone can celebrate somewhere.
New babies.
New babies.
Yeah.
New babies. You get married.
Yep.
Any sort of life event like that. There's Employee Appreciation Day, the first weekend in March, first Friday in March. Everybody can celebrate that.
Yeah,
exactly.
definitely.
Like, there's just always moments to communicate that value. And then, so that's like the foundation of this pyramid of recognition. The second one, so Awardco recommends 3 Celebrate programs. Now, however many you're doing, if you're doing 1, great, keep that up. We're not saying that 1 isn't enough. That's awesome. That's just a foundation that you can build on. And then we talk about recognized programs. These are programs that people are recognized for doing something that they have achieved or that they participated in or anything like that. So everyone can participate in Celebrate programs. Not everyone can do recognition programs. Jess, you were talking about at Vivint that a lot of your summer sales teams are very driven by competition.
Mm-hmm.
So what kind of programs do you use at Vivint to kind of help get those recognition programs?
Yeah, definitely. So with our National Inside Sales team, we have our brand and program incentive manager.
Mm-hmm.
She is incredible. Everything that she does is just like top notch. But they'll do 3 times a year. So they'll have one in March, one days of summer during the summer, and then they will also do one in the fall, the finals.
Yeah.
And really it's driving, whether it's installs and sales, so we also will align it to our business KPIs to make sure that we're driving those goals at the same time.
Yeah.
And for example, for one of them they did where they, depending on how many sales that they had during the week, they would get so many poker chips. And then we brought in a company that does like gambling games like poker and craps and all of that stuff. And then they could choose to either gamble their chips or keep them if their gambling's not their thing. And then they would do a silent auction for all of the prizes as well.
Cool.
And so there was a lot of it is doing the recognition is also helping drive that when we talk to competitions is tying that to what behaviors do you want to drive and what goals and KPIs do you need to drive in the business.
Absolutely. And that can also be used for driving behavior in terms of your company values.
Yeah.
Right?
Definitely.
If you tie it to your company values, and it doesn't even necessarily need to be monetary.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of studies out there that say that recognition or appreciation, whether it's attached to money or whether it's not, has the same impact.
Yep.
That's pretty powerful.
Okay.
So it doesn't have to be driven monetarily. If you're thinking about budgets, as a lot of us are right now at this time of year, and as a lot of us are looking at the next year, maybe a potential recession, and there's a little bit of anxiety around that, it doesn't have to be monetary. It just has to be a handwritten note. Hey, I recognized you, we're dealing with this, and we appreciate you for that, and it can be very simple. So that's the second tier of this pyramid of greatness. Thank you for sharing that, Jess. Celebrate, recognize, and then reward is the top tier. Reward meaning when an employee or someone goes above and beyond. And a lot of times employees are doing that a lot. So it's up to you how often you want to recognize for a reward. But we recommend 3 Celebrate programs, 2 recognition programs like a peer-to-peer or sales incentive or something like that, and then a reward program that is truly rewarding, something like Employee of the Year or Employee of the Month, something that is kind of difficult to achieve but can motivate people to achieve it and inspire others to do that same kind of greatness. So as we wrap this webinar up, we are going to have a Q&A. We encourage you to submit your questions for Jess and for Chad, but we want to encourage you to spread gratitude with everyone and everywhere and start with yourself. So appreciating employees boosts engagement. It increases profitability. It strengthens retention by reducing turnover. It helps the brain mediate anxiety and depression. Those 2 stats are from a Gallup study that was done in 2018 about all the impacts of recognition and appreciation. There's a lot more than just this. There's things about how it can improve quality, like it can reduce quality defects. It can help with absenteeism. It's incredible. There's a lot to it. And I think it's overlooked because it's so easy. Mm-hmm. So we want to invite you to expand your efforts of recognition. Successful HR leaders are 2 times more likely to have multiple recognition programs. So think about the recognition programs you're running now, whether it's a service anniversary or whatever it may be. Can you do something else with it? Can you improve it somehow? Even small incremental improvements will have a big impact. And then you can offer your employees the power of choice. So, as you can see here, 77% of HR leaders said their employees told them that choice was the number one reason their programs were ineffective. We don't want to hit on this too hard because everybody, I think, understands that the more choices you have, the better it is, whether that's in terms of a reward or any choice, right? The more choice, if you're looking for a new job, the more choices you have, great, you can select the one that fits best for you. So you can offer better rewards or better opportunities to recognize through multiple programs. And then in summary, just encourage gratitude with everyone and start with yourself. Expand your efforts and then offer choice as where applicable and where possible. So don't lose your most valuable resource, your brain up here. It will help a lot as you try and navigate whatever is to come in the future. So thank you so much for attending this webinar. Thank you, Chad.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jess, for all of your contributions and everything that you've shared with us. We're going to hop into a Q&A, so submit your questions, and we will start kind of answering those with the remaining time we have left. And here's the first one. Any thoughts on how to capitalize on recognition to prevent New Year turnover after bonuses are distributed? Great question.
Yeah.
Chad, what do you think?
I love that question because we actually are trying to combat that internally as well.
Yep.
And so what we've done is we've actually kind of parceled out the entire budget over the entire year. So instead of, let's say, for the sake of numbers, $1,200 as an annual bonus at the end of the year, we've actually divided it by 12. So everybody in the company will get, depending on your tenure, $100 every month. So it's encouraging that retention because it's like, oh, not at the end of the year, I get my check and then I bounce.
Which happens a lot.
You're
absolutely right. Yeah.
And so it's nice to, and for me personally, it's like, oh, it's really nice to get that little amount of money or points that I can then go spend in the platform. And it's every single month I'm like, oh, sweet, I just got, in my case it's 50.
Yeah.
But I get 50 points every single month instead of the lump sum at the end of the year.
Yeah. Just speaking from experience, that's really nice.
Yeah.
And it's a tiny little thing, right? But it's hugely helpful.
Yeah.
Jess, do you have anything to add to that one?
I think it's also, if you can plan things throughout the year, that keeps them invested, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And not just recognition, but if you've got people who are leaving at the end of receiving their bonus, my question is more about why aren't we retaining them? Are we not talking about career growth and development? Are they not engaged? Do they not see a career ladder there? Not just in a recognition program, right? So what are some of the other drivers for them being dissatisfied or having a flight risk? And if is it that they're chasing more money? Like sometimes you can't just hand out more money, right?
Sure.
As much as we all would love to have monopoly money. We can't, but it's also like exploring what are the reasons why they're not engaged or they're not committed to the organization.
Yeah, finding the source, right?
Yep.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
We have another question here. What can you do to recognize employees and colleagues if you don't directly manage them?
That's a great
Jess, what would you say to that?
I think there's various ways to do it, right? Sometimes I will take my peers to lunch, be like, hey, let's go grab lunch. And then while we're having lunch, just express my gratitude or recognizing the work that they've done. And then making sure I pay for that lunch too, right?
Oh, yeah, that's really nice.
And I think another way to do it, what I've seen, is also sending an email to that individual with their manager CC'd on it. So there's exposure there and visibility to their manager. There's so many various ways that you can do it. I just think it's making sure that you do communicate your gratitude and your recognition for that individual, but finding a way that's authentic for you. So whether it's, like I said, taking them to lunch, writing them a handwritten note, giving them a gift card. One of my good friends, I got her just a coffee gift card because I knew she was having a really rough time during the year, just very busy. And so I was like, you know what, she's going to need some coffee, so I want to tell her thank you for all that she's done. And even a $10 gift card is like, wow, they really see me.
Yeah.
So
it's not the amount, it's the effort that you put
exactly.
into it. That's really great. So we have time for one more question here, and we'll pose it to both of you. So before we wrap up. Most of our employees are not in office and hardly come by as they are working in the field. What are some suggestions for recognition? Chad?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when the question is posed as working in the field, I'm assuming they're actually like out, whether it's like a telecommunications company or something like that. If they're out in the field, or your sales reps that are out in the field, one of the things that we do that I really like is if let's say it's a foreman, can actually have these things called award codes, and you can actually hand them out like little physical cards that have like a little redemption amount on it. So it's not only kind of like, oh, everything's digital, it can also be physical because some people really appreciate those little physical cards.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really big win for a lot of those, whether that's construction, manufacturing, telecommunications, that have a lot of floor employees or out in the field, something like that. It's a really nice, tangible item to give to those people.
Yeah, definitely. I like that you said it doesn't have to be digital necessarily. That can enhance your efforts, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
Thank you. Jess, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I would start looking into what are your communication platforms and how do they function, right? Do you need to have different channels? Do you start we use Microsoft Teams.
Yeah.
And so we have a Teams channel strictly in our people and culture group. And that's where we highlight anniversaries, birthdays, any kind of announcements, but a lot of it is around recognition on the service awards side. So what are your communication platforms that you're using? That's going to be one way to connect your group from a virtual environment since they are remotely. And then what is understanding how do they want to be recognized, and is there a common theme across the individuals as well? They're going to have different recognition styles, all of us do as individuals, but if there's a common theme and there's a way to bring people together, or, if you've got a group that works in one area specifically and you've got a manager there, can you do like a movie night for a different region, right? So they may not be in the same physical location. Can you stream a movie for them, like a new movie that's coming out? Can you rent movie theaters in their physical location if you've got a few, or give them all tickets to go to the same showing? So just being creative in how you're going to pull them together and show that recognition.
Yeah, definitely. Both great ways to help out with people that are in the field. So we're about at time here. Thank you again, Jess, for your input and everything you've contributed.
Definitely.
Chad, thank you.
Of course.
Really appreciate you both being here. And thank you for attending this webinar. We really appreciate all your questions and all your involvement. And we'll just toss it back to HRE. And thank you for attending.